Welcome to our webinar, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Sales Teams. Our speaker today is Scott Williamson, Managing Partner and Founder of Revenade. He's also the leader of our Sales Effectiveness Practice and has 25 years of hands-on experience and has served as a Chief VP Sales role at startups and public companies. Due to the short nature of this webinar, we will not hold a Q&A session at the end. If any questions do arise throughout the course of the presentation, please contact Scott via the contact information at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Dee. And thank you for all of you who are in attendance. For those of you who are here in Houston, we're experiencing wonderful weather, which is sort of an amazing thing. But for the rest of you, we hope that this has been a successful year so far from a sales point of view. And we will do our best today to make sure that we are good stewards of your time and that we have a way in which we can share some of our lessons learned with you. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today. The core thing is that we have these seminars from time to time, these educational sessions to share our lessons learned with you. And today, the reason why we're here is that in the latter part of 2013 and early part of 2014, Revenade conducted a series of surveys where we were looking to firms that we call enterprise-level sales firms, meaning firms that engage in complex sales cycles where there are multiple buyers and multiple sellers in any given sales cycle, with an eye towards trying to figure out how we could gain some insight into what distinguishes a top-performing sales team versus their average and lower-performing peers. So, there's a lot of emphasis in the market in making sure that each of us has salespeople with the appropriate sales techniques. There hasn't been as much emphasis in the market with respect to understanding how sales teams differentiate themselves, the top performers versus the bottom performers. So today we'll focus on that, and I guess the key thing to understand initially is who is it that we surveyed, because as you've probably seen with other surveys out there in the market and the conclusions that people draw, the conclusions are only as good as the people who were surveyed and the data that came from those surveys. So the first thing to understand is that we did a broad-based survey, meaning we didn't just look at one market subsegment. What we did is we looked at companies with annual revenues ranging from greater than $1 billion, and with those companies, we're going to categorize those as large companies. We looked at mid-sized companies where their revenues were anywhere from $100 million to $1 billion. And then we also looked at more entrepreneurial, smaller businesses where their revenues were less than $100 million. Now, we did this on purpose so that we could see if there were any patterns that emerged from the large to mid-sized to small-based companies. We have a variety of different theories at Revenade as we've worked with companies of all these different sizes as to the natural advantages that a large company might have versus a small or a mid-sized company, or conversely, the advantages that a small company might have compared to a large company with respect to how they sell. As we looked at the data, we found that the results were very, very surprising. And as we go through this, I'll do my best to highlight where we saw data that was outside of the norm, as well as we'll look at data, highlight data where we think a small company had a distinct advantage or disadvantage over large and vice versa. Now, the first question from our survey was focused quite simply on asking our respondents or asking our survey group to rate their sales performance for 2013 versus plan. And since we did the survey towards the latter part of 2013, and even in some cases the early parts of 2014, in almost all cases the data that was coming back from our respondents was based on actuals. Now, we've done this in the past, and typically what we find is that there's a fairly normal bell curve distribution with respect to the responses, meaning that, roughly speaking, about 20% of the respondents feel that their performance exceeded plan, 20% or so felt their performance failed to meet plan, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. What we do see, though, from previous surveys, and what we think we're seeing also with this survey, is that that result can be skewed based on a variety of other economic factors. in this case, what we saw is that by far, the group was much more positive with respect to what their 2013 sales were according to plan. Now, this can have a variety of different reasons as to why this is, and we'll start to explore this as we go through the rest of our presentation. The important thing, though, is that the market was responding very, very favorably. In this case, more than 81% of the population of respondents felt that their sales in 2013 were above plan. The second thing we looked at was more of a predictor. In this case, we asked people to predict how they felt their 2014 sales would be, and we did this in comparison to 2013 sales. Now, normally, we also see a fairly bell curve-oriented distribution across the respondents, but in this survey, what we found was a very strong skewing towards the positive side. We found that only 9% thought their sales would be equal to that of 2013, and by far, the vast majority of the population of respondents felt that their sales for 2014 would be more than 2013, and in some cases, in this case, quite a few, 34% of the population felt that this would be their best year ever. Now, this is one of those cases where I'll highlight some of the differences between small, medium, and large-sized companies. By far, everybody across that sample set was very positive about their 2014 predictions. However, we will say that the smaller companies were more positive, and there were more respondents in the group of the 2014 prediction that felt that their sales would be greater than 2013. This leads us to a few natural questions, a couple of which I have highlighted here. The first is, why did so many of these companies meet or exceed their goals in 2013? And then related to that, why is it that no one for 2014 is predicting that their sales will be worse than 2013? We had more than 500 companies in this set. We would have expected that somebody would have come out with a negative response. Upon looking at the data further, we found that our survey respondents were primarily contained in the state of Texas or had a majority of their sales interests either in the energy industry or in the high-tech sector. And what we know by looking at the economic data from Texas, the economic data for the energy industry, and the economic data for high-tech sectors is that each of those three areas is performing above the nationwide averages with respect to recovery from the 2008 to 2009 timeframe. So if we think about this, as JFK said, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats from an economic perspective. And while we believe this is true, we're also wondering about the opposite corollary to that. So what happens when the tide falls? Will this same set of data that we have immediately take a turn towards the worse? And if we were to, say, survey at the end of this year, and let's say that 2014, for a variety of reasons, if it were to happen where the economic data would be bad, would we see that same sample set with the same distribution, or would their results be far skewed to the negative? Well, the rest of our survey and our analysis is really focused in on how we can further break down the data to see if those teams that are reporting very strong results for 2013 and strong predictions for 2014, are they displaying the same sets of habits, and what can we do to show any differentiation between the high-performing teams and those that are not high-performing teams? Well, I think a sales presentation or a sales education session wouldn't be a sales education session without some sort of corollary or some sort of story related to sports. I will tell you that 2 weeks ago, when we gave the first presentation related to this series, this slide had a variety of pictures from highlighting the University of Kentucky. But as those of us who are basketball fans know, of course, UConn won the NCAA tournament. And when you dive further into winning teams on the sports side, or if you look at personal success in terms of teams, or if you look at the business world, the first habit really becomes very clear, and that is that effective sales teams operate as a team, and they have a common purpose. In order to understand this and to give you greater clarity into how we come up with this first habit, let's look at some of the data that we've analyzed. So we have access to a number of questions that were asked, or a number of statements that were posed to a variety of different teams those that were strong performers and those that were weak performers from the sales point of view. And in each case, the teams were asked to relate to the question or to the statement and say, do I agree with this or do I not? So all of the questions and statements I'll be going through for the next several slides will be related to, when you see a number, in this case, strong performers at 71%, it means that they agreed with this particular statement. So the first statement was trying to understand whether or not everybody within the sales decision cycle had a good understanding of the actions and decisions for which they were responsible. And we find this is very, very important in the sales world, because oftentimes with sales, you have field sales teams who are acting on their own, and there's a fair amount of autonomy. You can't expect that field level management or corporate management are going to have the ability to jump in and take control. So what this means in this case is that we found highly effective sales teams, strong performers, related to this particular statement 71% of the time, whereas weak performers only did 32% of the time. So more than a 2-to-1 advantage from the highly effective sales teams versus those that were not. And what this means is that salespeople in the field have a strong indication and knowledge of what it is they're supposed to do, as well as the decisions that they're supposed to make in the field. Now, the next thing that we want to make sure our sales teams understand is that if they are going to make decisions in the field, we want to make sure that they're not being second-guessed with this. And so as we poured through the data, we also found that highly effective sales teams were much more likely to relate to this. So not only did they have the knowledge of which decisions they needed to make, not only did they have the knowledge of which actions they were going to take, but they knew that their decisions, more often than not, were not going to be second-guessed. And what this amounts to is this provides a level of confidence with your sales team out in the field, and it makes perfect sense that highly effective sales teams would relate to this statement much more than weak-performing sales teams. Confidence is a key characteristic, as we know from other studies we've done for salespeople, and this is a leading indicator into that. The next statement we looked at, and set of characteristics, were related to the information that's gathered out in the field and how quickly does competitive information get back to corporate. What we found is with highly effective sales teams, competitive data from the field is getting back to headquarters quickly so that decisions can be made. Yes, field sales teams need to be able to make decisions in the field. They need to not feel like they're being second-guessed, so they have that level of confidence. But they also need to have a conduit into corporate to share competitive information, because sales is a very dynamic environment. Much like the basketball example I used, teams can react to the offense you have, and they can play better defense. And that information needs to get back to the coach so the coach can make the appropriate changes as need be. Once again, we found that strong performers are very much aligned with this statement, whereas weak performers are not. Also related to information, what we found is that strong performing teams, by a very large margin of more than 2-to-1, relate to the statement that information flows quickly and freely across organizational boundaries. With the survey set that we looked at, remember I said that each of the companies in the mix was involved with complex sales, so enterprise level sales, multiple buyers, multiple sellers. What this typically means is that sales teams consist of maybe a sales leader as well as subject matter experts or other sales overlays, and it's important that that information is getting across all the different areas within that buying cycle on that selling team. So again, it makes sense that strong performers would more closely relate to this. There's a common purpose, and there's a common set of actions and understandings on those teams related to that. Finally, the statement that we looked at from a characteristic point of view of strong performing teams is that whether or not employees have the information they need to be able to understand the bottom line impact of their choices. Far too often we hear of the stereotypes of salespeople only being able to sell by cutting price. And in this case, as we looked at the data, we found that the highly effective sales teams related very strongly to this statement, where they understood the actions, the decisions, the information, the flow of information across those teams, but they also understood the bottom line impact of decisions they were going to make during the sales cycle, whereas weak performers didn't. They were more or less flying blind. They didn't really know, in the basketball example, that bottom line impact is I need to make baskets, I need to play defense, I need to win the game. And so they were just out on the court having activity without having that activity really focused. The next set of data we looked at that became a very strong correlation to highly effective sales teams is that these teams understand how to get the right people into their organization, and they understand how to put them in the right roles. So to back this up, the data that really drove this in part was related to the fact, a question we asked of our sample set of, do you have enough of the right salespeople in your organization? Now, the interesting thing here is that both strong and weak performers felt that a majority of the time they did have the right salespeople. But we found that strong performers by far had more of the right people in their organization than those of the weak performing set. We find this is very important. As we analyze the data, we found that sales managers in many cases are very similar to an NFL head coach in the terms that they need to understand the game plan that they think is going to win the game, need to understand the competition, need to understand the boundaries and the plays and the rules, etc. But without the right people in the right roles, it really doesn't matter how good the game plan is. This is further backed up by additional analysis we've done where we have access to results from a Manpower, the large international staffing and people organization, set of surveys they've done. And in the last 8 years, what they have been doing is they've been looking for the 10 hardest positions in the market to fill. So think of the hundreds and hundreds of different roles that you can fill in a professional business environment, from engineer to salesperson to accountant and HR professional, etc. And what they found is that the sales rep role is either the first or second hardest position to fill in the last 5 of 8 years. And in all cases, it's been in the top 5 hardest or greater hardest positions to fill through the last 8 years. So what this means is that the highly effective sales teams are able to find and retain and bring these people on. They're also able to put them in the right roles and make sure they're doing the things that they need to do. We'll touch later on some additional sample sets of data that we have access to that will further validate this. Now, related to this, the third habit that we found with highly effective sales teams is not only do they have the common goal, they have the right people in the right roles, but they understand how to appropriately prioritize the execution activities of their sales team. Sales, by definition, is an execution-oriented activity. Salespeople are not expected to go out there and define corporate strategy. They're not there to develop marketing materials or to create products. They're there to execute. And interestingly enough, what we have access to from the Qvidian survey from 2013 backs us up, saying that 90% of the leaders inside of corporate America are saying that sales execution is a top 5 corporate priority. We have a similar saying here at Revenade. We've all heard of the time value of money, where if I have $1 that I invest and I have an interest that I'm getting on that money, that over time the value of my money will grow. From a salesperson's perspective, we look at it from instead of the time value of money, we look at it from the money value of time, meaning that the only thing that a salesperson can do to really increase their productivity is to better use their time. Related to this, what we've done is we've analyzed the data about where strong performers and weak performing sales teams really spend their time. And in both cases, we looked at what we called execution-oriented activities. And we were somewhat kind about what we included in executing activities. In this case, we included direct selling time, customer service time, and order processing time, because in all cases, this is related to the actual cycle of selling. In this case, the interesting thing is that highly effective sales teams spend about 57% of their time in direct selling activities, whereas weak performing teams were only 50% active during this cycle. Now, you'll notice that there was a large percentage of both sets of teams where they were spending a large percentage of their time on administrative activities or travel activities, but weak performers were spending 36% of their time either doing administrative activities or spending time on that dreaded category of other. So related to this then, as we looked at the sample sets of data, we saw that the fourth habit is that highly effective sales teams leverage a very repeatable and well understood and well-known sales cycle. Now, this ties very much into a sales maturity model we have developed at Revenade, ranging from level 1 to 5, and I won't take you through all the data here. it's a little bit of an eye chart. But if you think of it in these terms, if you think of level 1 companies are the most immature with respect to their ability to sell in a repeatable, predictable, scalable way, everything's kind of a one-off. Every sales deal is chaotic. We're running around trying to figure out what to do. The level 2 people understand that they need to have certain processes in place, and there's some predictability with respect to their sales, but largely it's based on individual people. And levels 3, 4, and 5, they're starting to actually automate these processes and make it so that their sales processes aren't fully dependent on just a handful of people. And obviously, best-in-class sales organizations are able to streamline through automation and are looking for ways to where they can get 95% or greater predictability into their sales forecast moving forward. Now, in order to understand the data, and what helped us really come up with this highly effective habit, if you will, is that we surveyed the data, the respondents rather, the survey group, to understand who's producing the most sales inside of an organization. And again, normally this is sort of a bell curve distribution. Most companies like ours will look at this in terms of the high performers, the low performers, and everybody in the middle. We look at it a little bit differently. We differentiate the selling teams into 5 different categories, and we believe that additional differentiation provides us more insight into the teams themselves, as well as how to define sales process that would really be repeatable. Based on our analysis, we found that the top 20% of the organization are bringing in somewhere in the range of 62% of the revenue. That's pretty substantial when you think about it. That means that if you had a team of 10 people, 2 people are doing most of the work, by far most of the work, and the other 8 people are only bringing in about 38% of the revenue. Now, obviously, we need to find a way to correct that, and the analysis that we've done have found that strong performers, those teams that are highly effective in their sales, are leveraging very clear roles and the differentiation of those roles, the assignment of people into sales roles. They're using repeatable processes, and they're using technology that is not only well-defined, but it matches the client's buying cycle. And this is sort of the key findings from this data. So we found with these highly effective sales teams, if they really match their sales process very closely into the client's buying pattern, they have the ability, as we see on the right side of this chart, to take what used to be 20% of their high performers and turn that into 25, their next level from 30% to 35, et cetera. And so they can get more out of those same sets of people with more process. Now, I really like this graphic because I think it shows that even a child understands that in order to get great performance out of people, you need to have some form of incentive to drive the right behavior. And this was a rather obvious, but I think it's something we need to point out, habit that highly effective sales teams just do a better job of than their mid and weak performing peers. Now, this isn't new information. Based on a recent study we have access to, for the last year, $800 billion, and that's billion with a B, was spent on incentive compensation just in the U.S. alone. If you think about it, that's more than the Social Security Administration. It's larger than the Department of Defense. It's 3 times larger than all advertising spent in the U.S. that year. So you'd think that given all of that money that's being spent on incenting people, that everything would be working the right way. Well, also based on the data we found, a recent study we have access to shows that 48% of the incentive plans that are out there are really not having their desired impact. So do the math on that. We'll round it off here. So roughly 50% of the $800 billion is being spent foolishly. That's about $400 billion. Well, we found that highly effective sales teams are not misspending that money. And the key things that our data point out is that they do, in fact, have incentive comp plans in place. That's not a new or surprising finding. But we do find that their incentive comp plans are very role-based. They're not necessarily basing them on individual personalities, but they're basing them on the role. And they're differentiating between ultimate leadership, the midline management, and the reps. And they're doing this in such a way where they're incenting people based on their ability to have direct impact on whatever it is they're measuring. Now, with respect to what they're measuring, we've also found that a best practice across these highly effective sales teams is that on average, they're measuring 3 or less items, and they are incenting on 3 or less items. And revenue or sales is almost always one of those. And the final thing we've seen with just the straight incentive comp plan side of it is that those incentive comp plans for highly effective sales teams are very realistic. And this may seem blatantly obvious, but think about it here for a second. You know, when you were a child, maybe you were like me and you decided, I'm going to be a professional basketball player. And in high school, I would go outside and I would practice and practice, and I got pretty good at my jump shots. But you know what? I was never able to dunk on a 10-foot basket. And I realized I just was never going to grow to the point where I could do that. And so I stopped trying to do that. And it's also one of the reasons why I lobbied for an adjustable basketball hoop that would get it down to 8 feet so that I could. And then I raised it to 9 feet. And you know what? One day I actually got there. Now, this story is not about me and my basketball prowess or lack thereof. But the point is that if we set unrealistic goals for our salespeople, they will become so despondent by their inability to hit that it actually negatively affects their performance. We found that with strong performing teams, as it very directly relates to this, they also had quotas that had a common set of characteristics. The first is that they did some form, if there were territories with large number of accounts in there, they would do a top-down spread of their quota. So instead of trying to do an individual person-by-person, role-by-role build-up, if there were a large number of accounts in that particular territory, they would do a top-down spread of their quota. The second thing is that with areas where there were small numbers of accounts in a particular territory, it was more manageable to do a bottoms-up, they did that. But regardless of those two scenarios, in all cases, what they did was they spent time making sure that their quotas were achievable. And so with highly effective sales teams, we found a very strong correlation that at least 50%, but ideally greater than 50% of their sales team was able to reach or exceed quota. So they knew that the basketball goal, if you will, was attainable, and they tried and tried and tried to be able to get the ball into the hoop. We also found through our data that strong performers do a much better job of leveraging technology to support their planning cycles, tracking, and payment of compensation. In this case, I'm showing a screenshot of one of the offerings out there in the market, and this is one of those areas where small companies used to be at a disadvantage compared with large companies because the technology was just too expensive. And so what you found is that in many cases, companies were using Excel to be able to track this. Well, there are now a large number of cloud-based offerings that are very affordable that can be used through this cycle. The next thing that we found through our data is that highly effective sales teams are by far more focused, almost disproportionately so, on enabling and empowering their people. And this really takes shape in some of the data we've seen in that in 2013, the American Society of Training and Development conducted a survey, and they found that in the United States alone, $156 billion, again with a B, was invested in training, coaching, and professional development. That's a tremendous amount of money that people were spending on trying to make their salespeople better. And while that's an impressive number, our survey data also found that 82% of the leaders out there felt they lacked the information that they needed in order to be able to coach their sales people and sales teams. So if this is the case, what is it that strong performers are doing that the weak performing set are not doing? Well, we found that strong performers, number one, had a formal coaching program in place. So they recognized the fact that, yes, they did need to do this. It was an important corporate priority. But the second thing is they actually set metrics for measuring their people, and they had supporting technology to back them up. And again, in this case, I'm showing another cloud-based offering that shows for this particular person, Lisa Jones, here are the various things that we're measuring her on, or interactions, pipeline, results, and tasks. And then we're showing how she's doing with that so that the sales manager can go in there and coach her. This is another area where historically, and the data backs this up, smaller companies have not looked at this, but the technology is now affordable enough to where even smaller-based companies are able to use this type of technology to do this. And our data back this up that highly effective sales teams, even smaller sales teams, are tracking data about their sales team and then measuring them and coaching them based on the results from real activity. This ties very closely into the seventh thing we found, is that highly effective sales teams are leveraging data in the form of sales intelligence in a very timely way, an almost real-time way. They're doing this to track forecasting information, activity, opportunity analysis, etc. Unfortunately, another survey we have access to shows that 71% of CEOs and top sales executives find that 71% of them, at least, had a complete lack of confidence in the accuracy of their sales funnel. So the core thing that any sales organization should be tracking, which is what are my expected sales, what are my forecasted sales within the next quarter, month, 6 months, whatever the case might be. The vast majority of them did not have confidence in this. And so how can this be, and what are the strong performers doing to avoid this? Well, we found that the highly effective sales teams disproportionately were tracking both lagging and leading indicators through this cycle. Everybody was tracking current sales or historical sales, but highly effective teams were tracking higher and higher up in the funnel. So instead of just focusing on the core sales funnel that your CRM typically focuses on, they were focusing on the lead part of the funnel, the marketing funnel, as well as looking at account growth. And they were doing this through a series of KPIs or key performance indicators that they could use to track along the way. Now, they were doing this typically through a series of technology that did everything from scoring their leads to making sure that they had appropriate lead nurturing activities along the way, tracking their basic pipeline so that they could rate each opportunity and forecast it appropriately, and then finally looking down at the individual level with respect to how people were doing. So these are the 7 habits we found with highly effective sales teams, and some of these seem pretty obvious. Some of these may seem like they're not what you would have thought of initially. But what we found is that getting there really to a point where your sales organization has these 7 different areas doesn't really require magic. And we've developed what we believe is a very strong model for this. We call it our enterprise sales predictability model, which has been developed by vice presidents of sales and consultants alike, people who've spent large portions of their life waking up every morning, so to speak, with that gun to their head where they have to produce and hit a number or they need to find a new job. And so this model covers everything from the sales force structure, the roles and responsibilities and defining those, understanding how we have the appropriate coverage model to go out and capture the market opportunities we see there, making sure we take best practices from the sales process point of view and roll that out with the organization, helping folks work on their quota and their incentive, looking at the various people enablement and coaching and professional development, helping them understand the tools and technology and how to make that happen, and then looking at the KPIs and various sales intelligence we need to put in place so that our sales organization really operates appropriately. So this 7 different lens approach, much like if you go to the eye doctor, as they put each new lens on your vision, you get more clarity into what you're really looking at, and that's what our ESP process does. So that's the end of our session. My name is Scott Williamson. Again, I'm the Managing Director at Revinate. I hope that this 30 minutes has been a valuable use of your time. If you'd like more information about the results that we found or about some of our insights, or if you just want to share some of your thoughts, we often get very, very good feedback from these sessions, these educational sessions, and we also get ideas from people out there in the market as we share this information about additional studies they'd like us to conduct or services they'd like us to provide to help them. My contact information is on the screen. I'll leave this up for a few minutes after this presentation is over. And with that, again, I would like to thank all of you who attended. We had great attendance today, and we will continue to do these in the future on other topics. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dee. Thank you.
Again, thanks everyone for attending. Again, we just hope you see some value out of this session. Like Scott said, we'll be holding sessions like this fairly often. So if you have any ideas or comments, concerns, or topics that you'd like for us to cover, please let us know, and we'll keep those in mind. Again, if you have any questions that have arisen throughout the session, just feel free to give Scott a call or shoot him an email. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.